What if everything changed tomorrow? What if one accident, one unexpected injury meant that you couldn't work? And just like that, your paycheck, your health insurance, vanished, disappeared overnight. What if you were still willing to work, but you couldn't? What if you were able in mind and spirit, but you needed a wheelchair or hearing aids or a prosthetic limb just to make it to the job site? And what if you couldn't afford it? Now imagine trying to rebuild your life without a safety net. No insurance, no income, no options. For millions of Americans, this isn't just some worst case scenario. It's their daily reality. And the only thing standing between them and total collapse, between them and medical bankruptcy, between them and homelessness, or being forced into an institution, is Medicaid. Medicaid is a lifeline, and today we're going to talk about what happens when that lifeline is threatened and why every single one of us should care about it. Welcome back to Evergreen Perspective, coming to you from the Washington's 3rd Congressional District. This is a podcast where we break down events, policies, cultural issues that are affecting our community and beyond. We try to be as factual as we can. We try to be as clear as we can on how these policy decisions impact real world people in the real world. So I'm your host, Ben Chrisley, and today we're going to take that deep dive into one of the most critical yet misunderstood social programs in the United States. We're talking about Medicaid. So we're going to look into who relies on Medicaid, how it works, what happens when politicians try to gut it, and by the end of this episode, I hope you'll understand why, even if you don't personally use Medicaid, you should still care and care deeply about what happens to it. Because the truth is, life can change in an instant. And when it does, the difference between surviving and falling through the cracks comes down to whether or not you have access to care and resources to help you out. So let's dive right in. But before we do, I'm going to take a moment, as I promised, to continue to introduce you to myself. And so last time I mentioned, as a child, we moved around a lot. And one of the longest places we stayed was a small town out in the country in Kentucky. So from about the 6th grade through my senior year of high school, I spent some of my most formative years on a small farm. And so on that small farm, that's where I first learned the meaning of real hard work. Our family had a side hustle. We raised tobacco, or raised cattle and grew tobacco rather, or grew both. If you've ever worked on a farm, you know that's not easy money. There's no clocking out at 5. There's no skipping chores because of a holiday. There's no rest, all right? So the work is constant. It's tough. But that experience helped shape me and taught me the value of discipline and resilience and what it means to earn something through sweat and effort. And the reason I bring that specific story up today is that it directly ties to what we're talking about today. Because working hard should mean something, right? It should mean something in this country, but it often doesn't. Hard work doesn't always guarantee security. If you got sick, if you get injured, if life throws you something that you didn't plan, no amount of hard work can fix a broken healthcare system. So let's get into it. Medicaid, what's it do? It provides healthcare for about 80 million Americans, right? Including low income, men and women, seniors, people with disabilities. It's a lifeline for those who would otherwise have no access to medical care. And despite its importance, Medicaid is constantly under attack from politicians looking to cut social spending while ignoring the consequences for millions of vulnerable, hardworking Americans. In this episode, we're going to explore the history of Medicaid, how it works, who relies on it, and what happens when funding is slashed. We'll also address misinformation around the program, including the number one false claim is that non-U.S. citizens are eligible for benefits. All right? We're going to examine how the recent Republican budget proposal would impact Medicaid, its funding, and access to care. But before we get into policy and numbers, let's start with a real-world story, an example of why Medicaid matters. We're going to meet Jim. Jim Carter, he's a 27-year-old construction worker, and he was left permanently disabled from a construction accident. A beam fell, crushing his spine. It was leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Before the accident, Jim had health insurance through his job, a plan that, he assumed would cover him if something happened on the job. But, that's when things started to unravel a little bit for him. So at first, His private insurance did what it was supposed to do, right? If you've listened to, the other episode on healthcare, you understand how difficult this can be. It covered his emergency surgery and his hospital stay, but as soon as long-term costs kicked in, the denials started rolling in, right? That's how insurance companies make their billions in profit, is by denying care. He needed physical therapy. He needed it a couple times a week. They would only pay for 30 sessions a year. If he needed this to have a real shot at regaining his independence. He also needed a wheelchair, and not one of those generic ones you find at the five and dime store. He needed a legit wheelchair for his ailment so he could get back to functioning. But out of pocket cost was over $8,000. He doesn't have a job. How's he going to afford $8,000 for a wheelchair that he desperately needs? In home care, not covered at all. So his only other option might have been moving into a nursing home. I mean, he's 27 years old. He's 27 years old. He didn't want to do that. His medications that he was getting, $1,200 a month, but his insurance plan had a cap, so it left him responsible for hundreds of dollars, right? His insurance through work, guess what? It's gone now too, right? Because his employee didn't pay for it anymore. So his only option was to go to, that Cobra coverage. You've probably heard about it, right? It's like 3 times as much as what regular insurance would cost. And this it's not just bad luck. This is how private health insurance works in America. It's great when you're healthy and working, but the second you become too expensive, the system finds a way to push you out. Benefit caps, fine print exclusions, massive out-of-pocket costs. It's all by design, so they can kick you off the program, right? So that's when Medicaid became a lifeline for Jim. It covered his medical expenses, keeping him from financial ruin. It paid for the wheelchair he needed, an actual wheelchair he needed, so he could move independently. It funded his in-home care, so allowing him to live on his own instead of being forced into a nursing home at 27 years old. It covered all those physical therapy appointments he needed so he could get back to the best of his ability, right? This is the same therapy that private insurance wouldn't pay for. But here's the truth. James is far from alone, right? Millions of disabled Americans rely on Medicaid because private insurance either abandons them or it's completely unaffordable, right? Once they can no longer work, right? And yet, instead of strengthening the system that keeps people like Jim from being left behind, politicians continually want to gut the program. And that's exactly what we need to talk about today. How proposed Medicaid cuts could strip the safety net away, leaving people like Jim with nowhere to turn. If these cuts happen, millions could lose access to care, forcing them into nursing homes, financial ruin, or even homelessness, right? And then we just add to the homeless population. All right, before we get to the meat of the matter, though, let's bring on Kate for Kate's Civic Corner to give us some ideas on how we can get involved here in the 3rd Congressional District.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, folks. Kate here with the Civic Corner, taking a few minutes to highlight some opportunities to get involved here in Southwest Washington. If you're not in this area, get on the web and look around. I'm sure there are options in your area. We'll put a link in the show notes for each of these opportunities here in Southwest Washington and the events, where you can find more information, including what to expect and how to sign up. Coming up on April 8th at 6 p.m. is the Klickitat County Republican Central Committee meeting at the Dallasport Community Center. On April 10th, we have 2 events. At 6:15, Indivisible Greater Vancouver is holding an open meeting, and this will be at the Furstenberg Community Center. At 7 p.m., the 49th Legislative District Democrats have a meeting at the Unitarian Universalist Church. And the volunteer opportunity we're featuring this week is an ongoing one. The Lewis County Master Recycler Composter Group is looking for folks interested in learning more about how to reduce, recycle, and compost and share that knowledge. If that's something that interests you, check out the notes for more information. There's a link there. If there's an event in Southwest Washington that you'd like us to feature here on Evergreen Perspective, go ahead and put a note in the comments or shoot us an email. We'd love to hear about it. And that's it. This is Kate from Kate's Civic Corner, encouraging you to get out, get involved, and stay committed. Now back to Ben.
Thanks, Kate. So at its core, Medicaid is about one thing: whether or not we believe that access to health care should be a right, not a privilege. I firmly believe that health care is a human right for all Americans, not just those who can afford expensive private insurance. The U.S. Constitution makes it clear that the federal government exists to promote the general welfare of its citizens. I can't think of anything more fundamental to that mission than ensuring people have access to medical care. Medicaid was created to fulfill that promise, to protect the most vulnerable among us, ensure that no one is forced to choose between healthcare and basic survival. Yet, time and time again, it's used as a political bargaining chip rather than being strengthened to guarantee healthcare for millions of Americans. So, before Medicaid was created in 1965, healthcare in America was pretty grim for anybody who was elderly, disabled, or too poor to afford private insurance. There was no guaranteed safety net. If you didn't have money, you simply didn't work. You simply didn't get care. If you became too sick to work, you could lose everything, right? You could lose your job if you were too sick. You lose your home because you have no job and any chance of medical treatment because you simply couldn't afford it. Hospitals and doctors required payment up front, which meant that if you didn't have the cash, you were out of luck, right? So there were charity hospitals, of course, but they were underfunded, overcrowded, and often refused treatment for chronic ongoing issues. So a 1959 report from the U.S. Department of Health found that nearly 1 in 3 elderly Americans had no health insurance. Either they couldn't afford it or the insurance companies refused to cover them because of pre-existing conditions. They simply just kicked them off because of their age, just pure ageism, right? And it wasn't just the elderly who suffered; it was those that were disabled and couldn't work. There were no resources available. Nursing home care was practically non-existent unless you came from wealth. Families couldn't take care of their aging or disabled relatives. Many people were left with no option other than poorhouses, right? This is a real thing. State-run facilities that were no better than prisons, right? These poorhouses were a real thing. Disaster. Medical advancements were happening, of course, along the way here, but only to those that, had enough money to afford them. And so by the 1960s, life expectancy for low-income Americans was significantly lower than for wealthy Americans due to the lack of doctors and surgeries and life-saving treatments. And the sad reality is that gap has only gotten worse today. Studies show that the wealthiest Americans live 10 to 15 years longer than the poorest Americans. Some will say 7 years, some will say 10. But lack of routine medical care, untreated chronic illness, and the simple fact that healthcare in this country is too expensive, this all continues to contribute to that growing gap, whatever number you want to land on yourself, right? So for low-income families, the situation at this time was even worse. There was no guaranteed prenatal services, so pregnant women often went without basic medical care. That led to higher rates of infant mortality and serious birth complications that could have been prevented had they had prenatal care. Even today, the United States has the highest infant mortality rate of any first world nations. Babies born in the U.S. are more likely to die before their first birthday than those born to countries like Canada, Germany, or Japan, or any of the other ones that have health care. A major reason for this is lack of guaranteed prenatal care for low-income mothers, something that Medicaid helps address, right? Without it, many pregnant women would be unable to afford doctor's visits, screenings, early interventions that can prevent complications and save lives. So, kids born into poverty had it even worse, right? No access to regular checkups, no vaccinations, which meant that preventable diseases spread more easily, right? And early health issues went undiagnosed. And then, of course, there were, millions of Americans that died from completely treatable conditions simply because they couldn't afford care. Imagine, for example, being diabetic and not having money for insulin. That was a reality for so many Americans before Medicaid came around. It's still a reality today for many Americans. Insulin is a life-saving medication for millions of Americans, especially those with type 1 diabetes, right? Type 1 diabetes, condition you're born with. You have no control over it. It's not caused by lifestyle choices. Yet many families struggle to afford medication their loved ones need to survive. It's unbelievable. Come on, guys. Even with insurance, insulin can cost hundreds of dollars a month, forcing some people to ration their doses or go without entirely. It's not just dangerous, it's deadly. At least under the last administration, the Biden administration, they put a federal price cap set at $35 per month for insulin for Medicare recipients, making it more affordable for seniors. But earlier this year, Trump reversed a price cap on insulin that had been set for community health clinics that was serving low-income patients, making it harder for many working-class Americans and uninsured Americans to afford their insulin. This kind of policy decision that has real-life consequences right? No one should be forced to choose between paying rent and buying the medication that keeps them alive. Yeah, this is exactly the situation too many people face without programs like Medicaid, right? Back in the day, cancer patients were often sent home without treatment if they couldn't pay. People with mental illness were either locked away or in underfunded asylums or left to fend for themselves, often ending up homeless or in jail. So by the 1960s, it was pretty clear the system was failing, right? So more than half Americans over 65 had no health coverage. Hospitals were turning away poor patients. Charity care just simply couldn't keep up with the demand. The country had reached a breaking point. So in 1965, President Johnson signed Medicaid into law as part of the Great Society programs, along with Medicare care, which we'll talk about later. But the goal was simple, right? The goal was to provide coverage to low-income Americans, especially the elderly, especially the children, right? Especially the disabled. It was designed to ensure that no one would be denied life-saving care simply because they couldn't afford it. And it shifted some of that financial burden, obviously, away from the state-run charity programs that were, just caving in under the weight of people that needed care. So, like all things in America, it didn't roll out smoothly. Many states initially refused to implement it or delayed expanding the program. Hospitals in many parts of the country continued to segregate patients by race, denying equal care to Black Americans until federal enforcement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forced them to comply. This wasn't ancient history. It's not ancient history, guys. It wasn't that long ago. Many hospitals didn't fully desegregate until 1966, a full year after Medicaid was created. Some Southern hospitals at the time resisted compliance even longer, refusing to integrate until they were directly threatened with the loss of federal funding. That means there are a lot of people still alive today that were denied medical care simply because of their race, simply because of the color of their skin. It's a stark reminder that access to healthcare in this country has never been equal. And without federal enforcement, many hospitals would have continued to deny care based on the color of a patient's skin. So, Medicaid has expanded over the years to cover more groups: low income, pregnant women, children, people with disabilities, right? Seniors who need long term care. And every time it expands, it faces a political battle, right? Every single time. There are opponents who argue that government sponsored healthcare is some kind of step towards socialism or what other ism they want to slap on it to scare people. But let's be real, this isn't about socialism. It's not about big government, small government. The only ism that applies here is humanism. It's about taking care of our fellow Americans, our neighbors, our families, our communities. Because when people have access to healthcare, we build a stronger, healthier, and more productive nation. It's better all the way around for everybody. Right? This country was built on, right? The Constitution says we, the people. It doesn't say we, the corporations. It doesn't say we, the ultra wealthy. It says we, the people. The government exists to serve the people. The resources of this country, our tax dollars and money generated in this country, are supposed to be used to benefit of the people. Not just for endless war budgets, not just for corporate bailouts, but for actual Americans who need support when they need it. Right? That's not socialism. That's not some radical idea. That's the core responsibility of a functioning government, is to take care of its citizens. A government that prioritizes its citizens over profits. Government isn't meant to be a profit center. A government that understands that when people are healthy, its workforce is stronger, its economy is more stable, and its future is brighter. So when politicians try to put us against each other, when they try to make you believe that insuring someone else has healthcare somehow takes away from you, they're lying to you. They are lying to you, because the truth is, a nation that takes care of its people is a nation that thrives. And Medicaid is one of the clearest examples of that in action. And yet, here we are today, still we are today, having the same debate. Still hearing politicians talking about cutting Medicaid. Still watching working class and low-income Americans struggle to get the care they need. Meanwhile, the ultra-wealthy are getting richer and richer and richer. Richer than ever. The wealth gap in America is the largest it's been in modern history, with billionaires and corporations raking in record profits while everyday people can't afford basic health care. Instead of addressing this growing inequality, the Republicans and some centric Democrats in Congress is once again pushing for more tax breaks for the rich while proposing cuts to programs that help our most vulnerable citizens. And this isn't speculation. I'm not making this up. This isn't conjecture. It's right there in black and white in the recent Republican budget proposal. They are openly calling for cuts to Medicaid, along with other essential programs like food assistance and housing support. All the while, pushing to extend tax breaks for billionaires and corporations. The same people claiming that we can't afford to fund Medicaid have no problems handing out massive tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans, further widening the economic divide. This is the same playbook we've seen for decades, only now it's multiplied. They want to gut the social programs under the guise of fiscal responsibility, right? While funneling more wealth to those who already have the most. And the ones who pay the price, everyday hardworking Americans like us, just trying to survive, just trying to get by. Medicaid is one of the most successful public health programs in American history. Yet every year, it faces political attacks and funding threats. Cutting Medicaid would take us backwards in time, when millions of Americans had no access to care. It would mean more medical bankruptcies, more untreated illnesses, and more lives cut short. Not because we lack the resources in the United States, but because of poor political choices and policy. Right? Medicaid was created because the free market alone was failing millions of people. And history has already shown us what happens when healthcare is treated as a privilege rather than a right. People suffer and people die. And those are the facts. Right now, Americans owe about $220 billion in medical debt. I mean, that's a staggering number, guys. That debt isn't coming from people splurging on unnecessary procedures, or it's coming from basic care, life-saving care, cancer treatments, emergency surgeries, diabetes management, childbirth, routine visits. Nothing fancy, just the basics, life-saving stuff. Millions of Americans are drowning in medical debt, forced to take out loans or max out credit cards just to stay alive. Some are skipping treatment altogether because they can't afford the bills. And the very people who claim to be for fiscal responsibility want to slash Medicaid and make the crisis even worse. Cutting Medicaid isn't just cruel, it's reckless. It's a direct move to return us to a time when Americans were dying left and right simply because they couldn't afford care. Before Medicaid, if you were poor, elderly, or disabled, your choices were grim. Go without care, go bankrupt, or die. That's the reality. That's the reality we fought to fix. And now some chroniclers want to drag us back there with the lie that we can't afford it. We can afford tax cuts for billionaires. We can afford subsidies and corporate bailouts. We can afford a military spending that outpaces the next 10 countries combined. But somehow, when it comes to ensuring that a single mother can afford insulin for her child, or that a senior, can receive nursing home care, we suddenly don't have the money. It's bullshit. Cutting Medicaid isn't about balancing the budget. It's about taking from the most vulnerable Americans and giving it to those who already have everything. It's right there in the budget. It's clear as day. They aren't hiding it. They want to gut social programs that keep Americans working, that keep Americans afloat, all while ensuring the ultra-wealthy continue to hoard more wealth at historic levels. If we allow Medicaid to be gutted, we aren't just cutting a budget line. We're sentencing people to unnecessary suffering, unnecessary early deaths. We're choosing a system where your bank account determines whether you live or die. And we've already seen where that road leads, guys. We can't go back there. We can't go back. So let's talk about Medicaid. It's often talked about in broad strokes. All right, so let's talk about what it does, actually who it serves. So at its core, Medicaid is a program designed to provide health care to people who can't afford it otherwise. It covers some of the most vulnerable populations in our country. People who without it would be left without access to even basic medical care. So Medicaid is designed to cover low-income families, children, pregnant women, and the elderly and people with disabilities. I'd say this is people worth taking care of. But here's the thing, not everyone in low income qualifies. Each state sets its own rules for Medicaid. So that means care you can receive depends heavily on where you live. So here in Washington State, where I'm at, Medicaid operates under Apple Health, and it provides that healthcare coverage to low-income residents based on your income, uh, your age, your pregnancy status, disability status. You know, eligibility varies depending on your categories. Now, Washington is a little bit more progressive in its Medicaid policies compared to many states, particularly in extending coverage to some undocumented immigrants. But it's important to understand how this works. Undocumented immigrants do not qualify for full Medicaid benefits under federal law. Period. Federal Medicaid funds cannot be used to cover undocumented individuals, and Washington follows that law. However, Washington State has chosen to use its own state funds to provide limited health care coverage to certain groups, specifically pregnant individuals and children, recognizing that the public health benefits of ensuring access to essential medical care is much more beneficial than not providing it, right? The state funded coverage is not full Medicaid and does not provide the same range of benefits as federally funded. Apple Health instead is focused on maternal and child health, emergency care, and certain limited services for this specific group of non-citizens. So, once again, that most persistent myth about Medicaid is that undocumented immigrants are receiving taxpayer-funded benefits on large scale. Let's be absolutely clear. I want to be very clear about this. If you hear nothing else out of this podcast, undocumented immigrants do not receive full Medicaid benefits anywhere in the U.S. Even legal immigrants, those who are here on visas or green cards, must meet very strict residency and income requirements before they qualify. Right? So when politicians push the false narrative that undocumented immigrants are draining Medicaid resources, they're either severely misinformed or intentionally misleading you so you support cutting the program. The reality is that Medicaid serves American citizens and legal residents who meet strict eligibility rules. The small amount of state-funded healthcare Washington provides for certain non-citizens is not the same as full Medicaid benefits, and it does not impact the federally funded program that millions of Americans rely on. All right, so I'll make that clear. But even for citizens, Medicaid is not a guaranteed safety net. For example, if you're an adult with no children and you're struggling financially, you may qualify for Medicaid in some states, but other states you just be out of luck. So if you're working, say, a minimum wage job, which minimum wage needs to increase. That's a different podcast. But if you don't have employer-sponsored insurance, right, whether you're not on Medicaid depends on where you live. And if your state didn't expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, you could fall into that coverage gap, where you make too much to qualify for Medicaid, but not enough to afford private insurance. And that's millions of hard-working Americans that are left without access to healthcare because political decisions, policies, right? Not because they don't need it, not because our country can't afford it. All right, at the end of the day, Medicaid isn't some free-for-all program that hands out benefits to just anyone. It has strict rules. And the people who rely on it are overwhelmingly all American citizens. They're seniors, children, people with disabilities. The problem isn't that too many people are on Medicaid. The problem is that too many people who need health care are left out of it entirely because of outdated and restrictive policies. So, what does Medicaid cover? What's it cover? At a minimum, Medicaid covers hospital visits, doctor's visits, maternity care, long-term nursing home care, and mental health services. It also covers prescriptions, medical equipment like wheelchairs that we talked about for Jim, lab tests, and preventative care. But again, state coverage varies by state. Some states provide extensive mental health services as well, while others provide only the bare minimum. So for elderly Americans, Medicaid is one of the only ways to afford long-term nursing care. Right? Medicare, which we know is the program that covers people over 65, does not cover long-term care beyond short rehabilitation periods. So if you're a senior and you need full-time nursing home care, Medicaid is likely the only way you can afford it, unless you're extremely wealthy. By extremely wealthy, I mean way more than you think it is, and likely more than most Americans can afford unless you're in the top 5 or 10%. And if you can't afford it and you're that rich, you're likely to probably just stay in your own home and hire around the clock care. Because on average, a private room in a nursing home costs approximately about $117,000 a year. So here in Washington State, it's about $105,000. So these high expenses make Medicaid an essential resources for seniors requiring full-time nursing home care because not many individuals can afford such a cost without assistance. So cutting Medicaid doesn't just hurt young families or low-income workers, it directly impacts seniors who have worked their entire lives to need to now need that care. Right? They've worked their entire life so in their later years that they could live with some dignity. So if you're thinking, oh, I would just pay for myself, ask yourself, how long can you afford $114,000 a year once you retire? Because the time comes for most Americans that you're going to need some kind of home care, generally speaking, for most of us. Right? So, how is Medicaid managed? This is where things get a little messy. Medicaid is jointly funded by both federal government and individual states, but states control how it's implemented. That's why there's so many different coverages and eligibility state to state. The federal government sets a baseline, the baseline requirements, but each state decides how generous or how restrictive it wants to be. To complicates things further, Medicaid isn't even run by the government anymore, right? Instead, many states contract with private insurance companies. They're called managed care organizations or MCOs to administer the Medicaid programs. That means that Medicaid recipients are often dealing with the same bureaucratic red tape, denials of coverage, and coverage restrictions that people with private insurance face. So, and because these private companies are still profit driven, there are countless cases where they delay or outright deny essential care, making it even harder for people on Medicaid to get the treatment they need. So, but let's be very clear about this. What's happening here? When these private insurance companies deny care, they aren't just saving money. They're not saving your taxpayer dollars. They're making money. This is their profits. We don't get that back because they don't spend it. They keep it. A huge chunk of Medicaid is privatized, meaning that instead of the government directly paying for services, the payments are going to the MCOs, and then the MCOs determine who gets paid, right? They're private insurance companies, right? Repackaged under the Medicaid name. These companies receive billions of dollars from taxpayers to administer Medicaid benefits. But like I said, they don't make profits by ensuring that everybody gets all the care they need. They make profits by denying care, by delaying care, and keeping as much as our taxpayers' dollars as they can, as they possibly can. Right? Take nursing home care, for example. We know, we've talked about it, the average room cost, right? $117,000 to $105,000 a year. That's more than most seniors could ever afford out of pocket. Medicaid is supposed to step in and help cover these costs for these low-income and disabled seniors, ensuring that they get the long-term care they need. But when private insurance companies manage Medicaid, they routinely deny or delay the coverage for essential nursing home stays. This forces families to juggle their elderly around, right, into impossible situations, or going without care altogether, right, being shuffled between hospital or home or back again. A lot of times bankrupting these families who are just trying to pay for a bed at a facility. This isn't just about individual patients getting screwed over. This is a ripoff of every single taxpayer. Medicaid is funded with your tax dollars. Instead of that money going to the people that need care, these insurance companies are raking in $1 billion of profits, being pocketed by the insurance companies. Right? They're making record-breaking profits off our tax dollars instead of paying for the care that people get, right? In 2023 alone, the biggest private insurance managing Medicaid, like United Health, for example, made billions in profits while denying care to the very people Medicaid is meant to help. These companies take public money they're supposed to help the elderly, disabled, and low income and turn it into corporate profits by denying their treatments, rejecting their claims, and making people fight just to receive the care they are legally entitled to. Right? Every time. Every time. And every time they do, they keep a bigger share of your tax dollars while cutting corners on actual health care that's supposed to go out. This isn't just unethical, it's a systemic failure that hurts every taxpayer and Medicaid recipient in this country. The worst part, instead of fixing these loopholes and holding these corporations accountable, some politicians want to continue to cut Medicaid even further, ensuring that even more of that money is siphoned off to corporate profits, right? Because if they're not paying out, or they're not getting as much, they're going to keep more back because they got to keep driving their profits and their stock prices, right? Leaving the most vulnerable people in our society are left without care. So, ridiculous. So Why do some states have better care than others? We've talked about it a little bit, right? It comes down to politics and money. Under the Affordable Care Act, states were given the option to expand Medicaid to cover more people, with the federal government paying about 90% of the cost for those newly eligible. But in many Republican-led states, they refused to expand Medicaid, claiming it was too expensive, even though there was no money coming out of their state. It was coming from the federal government, already earmarked for them. Right? As a result, millions of low-income Americans in those states have been left without access to affordable health care. Even though Medicaid expansion has been proven to improve health outcomes and reduce medical bankruptcy. And the frustrating part is that these decisions aren't based on what's best for public health. They're based on some ideology, some outdated ideology that doesn't really take care of hardworking American people. The states that chose to expand Medicaid, on the other hand, have seen fewer hospital closures, lower uninsured rates, better overall health outcomes. Right? They made the choice to ensure that more people, especially low-income families, seniors, and people with disabilities, have access to health care. But states that refuse to expand Medicaid, they're facing rural hospital shutdowns, skyrocketing medical debts in their communities, and worse health outcomes for their low-income residents. A 2019 study found that Medicaid expansion reduced the likelihood of rural hospital closures by 62%. Yet 75% of hospitals at the highest risk of closure are in non-expansion states, overwhelmingly in Republican-controlled states that continue to reject the federal funds that could keep those hospitals open. These are the same non-expansion states that have also nearly doubled the uninsured rates of states that accept Medicaid expansion. When these people are left uninsured, it makes everybody else's health insurance goes up, leaving working class people to pay more, right? And yet, instead of fixing these problems, Republican lawmakers, many of whom claim to be the party of the people, they're doubling down, pushing for even more cuts to Medicaid. Their recent budget proposal that we talked about explicitly talks about calling for slashing Medicaid funding, all while at the same time they push for even more tax breaks for billionaires and corporations. It's hypocrisy at its finest. They talk a big game about being for the working class, but when it comes time to actually govern, their policies directly hurt the hardest working Americans. These Medicaid cuts don't just affect the unemployed or people in extreme poverty. They impact millions of working class families who are struggling to get by. These are the construction workers, our service industry employees, factory workers in instances, farm workers, the people who keep our country running. The very people Republicans claim to fight for are the ones getting screwed over the most. And let's be real, this isn't about fiscal responsibility. If it were, why do we always have money for these massive corporate subsidies and corporate bailouts, tax cuts for billionaires, and a bloated defense budget? But somehow, when it comes to making sure low-income families can afford a doctor's visit, suddenly we can't afford it? Give me a break. It's not about balancing a budget. It's a deliberate choice to prioritize the wealthy over the working class. So when Republican politicians claim to stand for the people, ask yourself, which people? Which people are they standing for? Because from where I'm sitting, right, sure the hell isn't the ones who need it the most. And at the end of the day, Medicaid exists because private insurance market has failed everybody. If you're wealthy and have a high-paying job with great benefits, man, that's awesome. You might not think about Medicaid at all. But for millions and millions of America, it's the only thing standing between them and financial ruin. Or worse, between them and a completely preventable death. Right? So one of the biggest myths about Medicaid is that it's for people who don't work. The truth is, most people on Medicaid are working or live in a household where somebody is employed. They just don't have access to affordable health care through their jobs, or they can't afford to buy it off the open market. Over 60% of non-elderly Medicaid recipients are employed, many in industries like construction, retail, food service, caregiving. These are the jobs that keep the economy moving, but they're also the jobs least likely to offer employee-sponsored health care. Without Medicaid, millions and millions of these workers would be left without access to basic health care, which directly impacts their ability to stay employed. Think about this. How can someone hold down a job they can't afford to treat a chronic illness? How can a mother keep working if she loses Medicaid and can't afford medication for her children's asthma? What happens to the restaurant worker who gets injured but can't afford physical therapy and ends up permanently disabled? These aren't hypothetical situations. This is real life for millions of hardworking Americans. Medicaid keeps people in the workforce. Medicaid helps people stay healthy enough to work by covering their doctor's visits, their medications, their preventative care. It keeps them healthy, right? It also funds the home health services, which allow family caregivers to stay in the workforce instead of having to quit their jobs to stay home and care for their sick or disabled relative. For many people with chronic conditions like diabetes, heart disease, Medicaid is the only reason they can continue working at all. Let's go back to our insulin example. Without Medicaid, many type 1 diabetics wouldn't be able to afford their insulin, which is a life or death medication. If you can't get your insulin, you can't go to work. If you end up in the hospital because you didn't get your insulin and your condition spirals out of control, you lose your job. And once you lose your job, you lose what little income you had, sinking you further in the hole. You see how it keeps going down, down, down? Right? Medicaid cuts hit the rural and working class communities the hardest. If Republican budget cuts go through, it's not the wealthy or even the upper middle class that will feel it first. It's the hard-working Americans. It's the working poor, the rural communities, the small business employees. Many of these communities are already struggling, and losing Medicaid could push them even further into economic collapse. So let's take rural jobs, for example, right? Industries like farming, manufacturing, service work, they don't often come with health benefits. In these regions, Medicaid is a major economic stabilizer, not just for individuals, but for the entire local economies. When people lose access to healthcare, they become sicker, they miss more work, and sometimes drop out of the workforce altogether simply because they can't function without the medical care they need. They don't get the medications they need. They don't get the doctor's visits or the things they need to function every day. And at the same time, Medicaid keeps rural hospitals and clinics afloat. So when states refuse to expand Medicaid, rural hospitals, obviously they're more likely to shut down, which means not only do people lose access to healthcare, but thousands of healthcare jobs disappear with it too, right? And what happens once that hospital shuts down? Businesses in that area start to struggle. Property values decline. The whole local economy suffers. And the Republican plan is to push more people into poverty, right? Republican lawmakers are actively trying to cut Medicaid, knowing full well that it will push millions of working Americans out of jobs and into deeper poverty. Their argument is that able-bodied adults shouldn't be on Medicaid. But here's the thing. Many people on Medicaid, as we've already talked about, are working. And the ones who aren't often can't work because they're too sick or they're disabled. Or they're acting as an unpaid caregiver for somebody that is too sick or disabled. If Medicaid is gutted, what happens to them? They don't just magically get employer-sponsored insurance. Right? It's not some magic wish that comes and all of a sudden they have health care coverage. They don't suddenly stop needing their medications or their doctor visits. They get sicker. They get poor. They fall through the cracks of an already broken system. Cutting Medicaid isn't just a war on healthcare. It's a war on working class people. It's taking away one of the few supports that allow low-income workers to keep their heads above water, right? Cutting it pushes people into poverty. It doesn't lift them out of it. And the worst part is the people making these cuts will never have to worry about affording their own health care because their taxpayer-funded congressional health plans will still be there, fully intact, while they take coverage away from millions and millions of hardworking Americans who actually need the help. So let's talk about what's actually in the Republican budget proposal. Because people will say, well, they're not cutting just Medicaid, right? But it's right there in black and white. So the plan calls for $1.7 trillion in federal spending cuts over the next decade. And guess what? $880 billion of that is coming straight out of the budget for Medicaid. These aren't small tweaks. These are massive cuts that would gut the program and leave millions of Americans without health care. So what exactly are they proposing? First, they want to cap federal Medicaid funding, which means that more states would be left holding the bag. So without enough federal support, a lot of states would have to cut benefits. Some states may even lose Medicaid altogether, right? Or be very slim pickings. They have to slash payments to doctors and hospitals. This means, obviously, fewer people are going to be covered, fewer services available, and more hospitals closing their doors. So especially in the rural areas, right? So then there's the push for stricter work requirements. Now, on the surface, that might sound reasonable, right? Make sure every able-bodied adult is working. But here's the problem. We've talked about this already. Most people on Medicaid already have a job. They're working in industries that don't provide employer-based health insurance, and they don't make enough to afford private insurance and still be able to maintain food and shelter. So, many caregivers themselves, disabled or dealing with serious health conditions, they're going to be out on the streets. Slapping work requirements on Medicaid doesn't get people into jobs. It just kicks them off their health care and probably makes them end up losing their job because they're too sick to get to work because they don't have medical care. And it doesn't stop there. They also want to eliminate provider taxes, which is a big deal because many states rely on those taxes to help fund their share of Medicaid. All right, so if those are taken away, the states are going to be forced to cut services even more. It's a domino effect. It leaves fewer people insured and more hospitals financially strained, right? So the impact is millions could lose their Medicaid coverage. Just the example I read, in Illinois alone, that could be 3.4 million people could be affected. Now imagine that playing out multiplied across the country. Hospitals and clinics, especially in rural areas, could be forced to shut down because they won't be able to stay afloat without Medicaid funding. Right? So for the people left uninsured, this means worse health outcomes, more preventable deaths, and more medical bankruptcies. So here's the bottom line. This isn't about saving money. It's about making life harder for low-income, working-class Americans. We always seem to have plenty of money for tax breaks for billionaires, corporate bailouts, corporate subsidies, and, of course, the endless defense budget, right? But when it comes to ensuring that a single mom can take care of her kid, take them to the doctor, suddenly we're spending too much? It's not fiscal responsibility, guys. That's a deliberate choice to prioritize the wealthy over everybody else. And the people pushing for these cuts, they're not losing their health care, right? We've already talked about it. They're still going to have their taxpayer-funded congressional health plans while they rip coverage away from people that actually need it. It's cruel. It's hypocritical. And it's exactly why we need to fight back. Because if we let this happen, millions of people, working people, sick people, elderly people, are the ones that are going to pay the price. One of the biggest problems with Medicaid conversation is the sheer amount of misinformation that's out there. People will make all kinds of wild claims about who gets Medicaid, who doesn't, and how it's supposedly being abused. Right? Let's be real. A lot of the misinformation is intentional. It is intentional information. It's pushed by lobby groups and politicians and special interest groups who want to gut Medicaid, and they rely on people not knowing the facts. So let's break down some of the biggest myths floating around. Let's touch on Medicaid versus Medicare quickly. People confuse them all the time, right? So Medicaid and Medicare, they're not the same thing, right? They're both government healthcare programs, but they serve different populations. Medicare is a federal program for people 65 and older, and some younger people with really severe disabilities. It doesn't matter how much money you make, you qualify for Medicare. You get it, right? You pay into it, you get it, it's yours. Medicaid, on the other hand, is based on income and need. It covers low-income families, seniors who need long-term care, pregnant women, children, people with disabilities. And unlike Medicare, Medicaid is run by federal and state governments, which is why it looks different depending on where you live. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody say something like, it's lazy people living off government health care, only to find out what they're actually talking about is Medicare, which is obviously for folks over 65 years of age that have worked their whole life for it. They're talking about their parents or their grandparents rely on, right? So that's the confusion we're dealing with here, right? Now, one of the biggest, most persistent flat-out false claims, and we've already touched on, is the idea that undocumented immigrants are receiving Medicaid benefits and that they're somehow draining the system. This is 1,000% false. Let me say that again for the people in the back. Undocumented immigrants do not qualify for full Medicaid benefits, period. Federal law explicitly bars undocumented immigrants from enrolling in Medicaid. The only exception is emergency Medicaid, which covers life-threatening situations, right? Severe injuries, childbirth complications, like life-threatening stuff. And even then, it's only for that emergency itself, just that emergency itself. There's no long-term coverage. There's no routine doctor's visits. There's no prescription coverage. Now, some more progressive states, as we did mention, like Washington, have chosen to set aside some funds for, some of these folks to also provide, those limited benefits to some undocumented groups, typically children and pregnant individuals. And the reason for that is really simple, actually. And it's a better fiscal investment because it's cheaper to provide prenatal care and vaccinations and deal with preventable health crisis than it is to deal with the health crisis when it comes when they were left untreated. But once again, that's not Medicaid. That's a separate state-funded program. So when you hear people say, "Why are my tax dollars paying for illegal immigrants' health care?" They're not. They're wrong. Your federal Medicaid taxes are not covering undocumented people, and anyone pushing that is straight up lying, or is misinformed, or they're deliberately trying to mislead you. So the other one that everyone says, there's a lot of fraud out there. It's another talking point you hear over and over again. Like, it's riddled with fraud. The people are abusing the system, getting benefits they don't deserve. It's a welfare scam. Again, wildly exaggerated. Is there some fraud in Medicaid? Sure. Just like any program, whether it's government or not. Just like any private insurance system. But Medicaid fraud is a tiny fraction of overall spending. In fact, the biggest cases of Medicaid fraud don't come from individuals at all, right? They come from big corporations and healthcare providers trying to game the system for more profit. Private insurance companies that manage Medicaid contracts have been caught overbilling states for billions of dollars, overbilling our tax dollars that we're paying. Hospitals and clinics have been caught charging Medicaid for procedures that were never performed or unnecessary tests, right? And then we know the other culprit, I don't even have to say it probably, starts with a D, ends in a G, drug companies, right? Overly inflating their cost to increase their profits. So when politicians talk about cracking down on Medicaid fraud, right, they're trying to make you imagine some random person, faking some injury to get some free benefits. But in reality, the biggest fraudsters are the massive corporations that are already making billions off the system, right? And guess what? The same politicians never seem to go after them, do they? Huh. Right? This misinformation is dangerous about Medicaid, right? Because at the end of the day, this kind of misinformation is used as a weapon. It's used to convince other hardworking Americans that Medicaid is wasteful, that it's being abused, that cuts are justified. It's used to divide working class, to make them think their neighbors are getting something that they don't deserve. Meanwhile, billionaires walk away with all the tax breaks and all the profit from it, right? The reality is Medicaid is a critical program, right, that keeps millions of working Americans, children, seniors, and people with disabilities from falling through the cracks. I mean, could it be approved? Of course. Of course it can be approved. But gutting it based on misinformation and political games isn't fixing or helping anyone. It's just hurting the people who need it the most. So where do we go from here? Right? What happens next with Medicaid? Right? It depends. Depends entirely on who's in power and how much attention the public pays to what's actually being proposed. Right? We know right now with the Republican lawmakers in control, we already know what the plan to do, right? Because it's written right there in their latest budget proposal. $880 billion out of the Medicaid budget. They're pushing for those work requirements, federal funding caps, massive spending cuts that could strip away millions and millions of people's health care. Their ultimate goal is to shrink Medicaid down, force states to shoulder more of the cost, and reduce the number of people who qualify. Right? The work requirement alone could kick millions of working class adults, many of whom already have jobs, but they don't get employer-sponsored insurance, and they don't make enough money to just go buy it off the free market. And capping federal funding would force states to make brutal choices, right? Either raise their state taxes to make up for the lost federal money, start cutting Medicaid services, dropping people from coverage, reducing what is coveraged, right? We know traditionally the Democrats would like a very different approach. They'd like to expand Medicaid access, right? Strengthening protections and addressing the issue of the private insurance companies making these billion-dollar profits off the system. Right? Some of their programs have focused on reducing the bureaucracy, closing the coverage gap in non-expansion states. That way we ensure that those rural hospitals can stay funded. But, let's be real. None of this happens. None of this happens if, we're not paying attention. If the voters aren't paying attention. If we're not demanding these changes, right? Medicaid doesn't, typically hadn't really made the headlines too heavy, right? It wasn't the big hot button issue that we all talked about, but it needs to be. These decisions affect millions of Americans, and it deserves as much attention as anything else, right? So, biggest thing is walk for who's talking about cutting Medicaid, who's talking about strengthening it. If you see politicians pushing for block grants or state flexibility, that's usually code for, hey, we're going to cut Medicaid or restrict its eligibility. If they're promoting work requirements, ask yourself who actually benefits from making it harder for people to access healthcare. If they're talking about reducing waste in Medicaid, are they actually targeting fraud, like real fraud, the billion-dollar fraud from the companies? Or are they just looking for an excuse to cut it and provide more misinformation? We also need to pay attention to the state level decisions. Not every Medicaid fight happens in DC, guys. Right? It's a lot of local stuff too, right here in the state. State legislators, right? Or governors and those lawmakers decide how to implement policy on Medicaid. So get involved every level, right? Some Republican states we've already talked about still refuse to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, even though the government pays 90% of the cost and it's already earmarked for them. This means millions of low-income people in these states are stuck in a coverage gap, right? We've talked about this time and time again. Too poor to afford private insurance, but not poor enough to qualify for Medicaid under their state's rules. So those are policy choices. And that choice is literally killing people. Whether people show up and vote for leaders who actually believe in protecting and strengthening the program. If the wrong policies go through, it won't just be unemployed who suffer. It'll be working class families, seniors in nursing homes, disabled individuals, and entire rural communities that rely on Medicaid funding to keep their hospitals open. So when you hear politicians talking about Medicaid, don't just listen to the buzzwords, right? Look at what they're actually trying to do, because the fight over Medicaid isn't just about a budget. It's about whether we believe that healthcare should be a right or just another privilege of the wealthy. So at the end of the day, Medicaid, it's not just some abstract government program. It's a lifeline for millions of Americans. Even if you don't use it, even if you have a great job with employer-sponsored insurance, Medicaid still affects you. It keeps your hospitals open, especially in the rural areas. It ensures that seniors can afford long-term care, that children can get the medical attention they need, that working class people aren't one illness away from financial ruin. It prevents families from having to choose between paying rent and buying life-saving medications. And when the most vulnerable among us are cared for, our entire healthcare system functions better, decreases unnecessary ER visits. It keeps people healthy, right? It keeps people out of the hospitals. If Medicaid is cut, it won't just hurt the people who rely on it directly. It will drive up healthcare costs for everyone. When uninsured people can't afford preventative care, they end up in the emergency rooms anyway, racking up massive hospital bills that get passed on to the rest of us. So when hospitals in small towns shut down because they can't afford to stay open, entire communities lose access to care, not just those who have Medicaid. Everybody that lives there, right? The whole local economy suffers. And let's not forget, many of us might not need Medicaid today, but life can change in an instant. Sudden job loss, sudden illness, catastrophic accident. You or someone you love can need Medicaid tomorrow. That's what the safety net is for. The real question isn't whether Medicaid should exist. It's whether we as a country are willing to let politicians rip it apart while handing out more tax cuts for billionaires. It's whether we're okay with going back to a time when people simply died because they're too poor to afford care. We can't afford to ignore this, so pay attention. Vote for people who actually want to strengthen Medicaid, not gut it. Push back when you hear misinformation. Because when Medicaid is on the chopping block, it's not just about numbers on a budget. It's about real people, real lives, real consequences. And that's where we're going to leave it today. Thank you guys for tuning in to Evergreen Perspective. As always, stay informed, stay engaged, keep fighting for what actually matters. Keep fighting for the everyday working American. We can't continue to let everyday working Americans continue to erode away as the middle class disappears, as all the wealth is hoarded on top, not leaving any for the rest of us. We got to fight for each other. We got to stand together, right? It's those that have versus those who have not. It's a class war, guys. We got to fight it together, right? So, once again, I'm Ben Chrisley. This has been Evergreen Perspective. Take care of yourself, and most of all, take care of each other.